Right now, the conflict between Iran and the United States has created one of the most confusing and dangerous geopolitical situations in recent history. With both sides presenting claims that seem impossible to reconcile, Iran says it has control over the Strait of Hormuz and is targeting oil tankers moving through the region, while the United States claims it has already destroyed Iran's naval capability, including the loss of 17 warships, to statements that cannot logically be true at the same time. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most critical energy routes on the planet, carrying nearly 20% of the world's oil supply, along with a significant portion of global, liquefied natural gas shipments, which means even the threat of disruption immediately affects global markets, pushing oil prices higher and creating anxiety across the international shipping industry. Analysts point out that controlling such a narrow waterway is not just about naval fleets. It also involves sea mines, coastal missile batteries, drones, and the credible threat that any vessel entering the strait could be attacked, and making the region extremely volatile, even if traditional naval forces are weakened. As a result, the crisis is already having serious economic consequences, especially for Europe, where energy prices, industrial output, and overall economic stability are closely tied to the steady flow of Middle Eastern oil. At the same time, the conflict took an even more dramatic turn, with reports that Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, aged 86, who ruled the Islamic Republic for more than 3 decades, was killed in a targeted strike, despite being heavily protected by military and intelligence forces. If confirmed, his death represents a major turning point in Iranian political history. But analysts argue that it may not create the collapse some observers expected, because Khamenei had spent years building a decentralized system of governance designed to survive exactly this type of crisis. According to several geopolitical analysts, key positions across Iran's military, intelligence, and civilian institutions were structured with multiple layers of succession, meaning that if senior leaders were eliminated, others could quickly step in to maintain continuity of command. This type of layered leadership structure explains why, despite the reported deaths of numerous senior commanders and targeted strikes on command centers, Iran's military operations, missile launches, and strategic decisions appear to continue without major disruption. In fact, one of the most striking aspects of the situation is that the identity of the individual or group currently directing Iran's strategic decisions remains unclear to outside observers, which many analysts believe is intentional, as keeping leadership hidden makes it far more difficult for foreign intelligence services to target them. The conflict has also produced significant political messaging from Washington, particularly when former US President Donald Trump publicly called on the Iranian population to rise up and overthrow their government, promising American support for such a movement. However, this call has not resulted in widespread protests or internal rebellion, and analysts say there are several reasons why such an uprising is unlikely under current conditions. First, civilians living under the constant threat of airstrikes, missile attacks, and military escalation are far more focused on basic survival than on organizing political protests against their government. Second, Iran's internal security apparatus, including the powerful Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and various paramilitary forces, remains largely intact and operational despite external attacks, meaning any attempt at mass protests would likely face immediate and forceful suppression. Third, there is currently no unified or well-organized opposition movement inside Iran capable of coordinating nationwide demonstrations or translating public frustration into a sustained political challenge to the ruling system. While some exiled opposition figures and political groups exist abroad, analysts note that they have little operational presence inside the country and limited ability to mobilize people on the ground during an active conflict. For these reasons, expectations that the Iranian government might collapse due to internal revolt appear unrealistic in the short term, especially while the country faces external military pressure. All of this raises deeper questions about the long-term objectives behind the conflict, particularly from the perspective of US strategy. Because despite significant military actions and escalating tensions, There remains no clearly defined political endgame or explanation of what a final resolution would look like, leaving the international community watching a rapidly evolving situation whose leadership dynamics, military trajectory, and global consequences are still highly uncertain. The justification for the war has remained unclear from the start, with different explanations offered at different times. At one stage, American officials argued that Iran was close to acquiring a nuclear weapon and needed to be stopped before it crossed that threshold. Later, another explanation focused on Iran's missile capabilities, suggesting that the country possessed weapons that could eventually threaten the American homeland. In yet another statement, the strikes were described as a preemptive move designed to stop a possible Iranian attack before it could happen. However, despite these shifting reasons, there has been little clarity about the ultimate objective of the conflict or what a final victory would actually look like. This uncertainty makes the situation increasingly dangerous, particularly as Iran appears to be responding with a calculated strategy rather than simply reacting to attacks. Analysts suggest that Iran's use of drones and missile systems may be designed to gradually exhaust enemy air defense systems by forcing expensive interceptions against relatively cheap drones, slowly reducing the available defensive capacity before potentially launching more accurate and destructive strikes later. At the same time, the conflict risks expanding across the region, as groups aligned with Iran such as Hezbollah and Iraqi militias have already become active, while the Houthis, considered by some analysts to be among the most capable members of Iran's wider network, have not yet fully entered the conflict, leaving open the possibility of future attacks on critical infrastructure or shipping routes if regional tensions continue to escalate. This broader regional dimension raises serious concerns for global stability, especially because the situation does not appear to be approaching a clear resolution. According to some geopolitical analysts, the most politically vulnerable participant in the conflict may actually be the United States. Not because of military weakness, but because of the nature of its democratic political system. Unlike Iran or Israel, which may view the conflict as an existential struggle and therefore remain committed to continuing the fight regardless of cost, the United States faces strong domestic political pressures that can rapidly change the course of foreign policy. Rising economic costs, increasing energy prices, potential military casualties, and political opposition within Congress could all influence public opinion and eventually push lawmakers to reconsider continued involvement. In this sense, the world's most powerful military force may find its options limited, not by enemy strength, but by internal political dynamics and democratic accountability. Meanwhile, the countries of the Gulf region face a particularly difficult and complex situation. If they openly support the American campaign and the Iranian government were to collapse as a result, they could find themselves facing decades of hostility from a large neighboring nation that might view them as responsible for the destruction of its political system. On the other hand, attempting to remain neutral may not protect them either, as Iranian missiles, drone strikes, or attacks by allied militias could still target regional infrastructure and economic assets, regardless of official positions. This creates what many analysts describe as an almost impossible dilemma for Gulf governance, where every available choice carries serious long-term risks. Some regional leaders have reportedly warned the United States about these dangers and urged caution, arguing that abandoning diplomatic negotiations in favor of military escalation could lead to consequences far beyond what initial strategic calculations predicted. Reports suggest that several factors may have influenced the decision to move forward with military action, including the perceived opportunity to eliminate key Iranian leadership figures, persistent pressure from regional allies who view Iran as a major threat, and the belief that a decisive strike might deliver a significant political victory at home. However, as the conflict continues, that expectation appears increasingly uncertain. What may have been envisioned as a short and decisive operation now risks turning into a much broader geopolitical and economic crisis. Oil prices have already shown signs of instability. Energy markets remain highly sensitive to developments around the Strait of Hormuz, and global shipping routes are facing growing uncertainty. Because such a large portion of the world's energy supply passes through this narrow corridor, even limited disruption can create immediate ripple effects across international markets. For Europe and many other parts of the world, the consequences are already becoming visible through rising energy costs, growing concerns about economic stability, and renewed discussions within international alliances such as NATO about potential security implications. As long as the conflict continues, without clearly defined goals, a realistic exit strategy, or meaningful diplomatic progress, the risk of further escalation will remain high. Instead of appearing as a short regional confrontation, the crisis increasingly resembles the early stages of a prolonged geopolitical struggle with global economic consequences, where each passing day raises the possibility that the conflict could spread further and become even more difficult to contain.